Today, we have Julia Pimsleur, CEO and author of $1 Million Women, a company helping women founders grow their businesses past $1 million in revenue. Her last company, Little Pim, was a venture-backed edtech startup company that she raised several million for and ended up leading into a successful exit. Julia opens up about the difficulty of raising capital as a female entrepreneur, how she sold her last company, and now how she supports female founders. It's an eye-opening episode. Let's dive in. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today we have Julia joining us, founder and CEO of $1 Million Women. Thanks for having coming on the show, Julia.
Great to be here, Jason.
I'm excited to have you. You have a very interesting background as someone that's raised venture capital many years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, and basically doing it again now. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you're doing at $1 Million Women.
Well, I'm not a typical entrepreneur journey, if there is such a thing, in the sense that I started out as a documentary filmmaker and then decided I wanted to create a language teaching program for young children. So that was my first venture-backed business. Little Pim, right? What's the connection there? Basically, I was home on maternity leave with my first son and knew I wanted to teach him French. There was nothing on the market to teach little kids a second language, even though that's the time they learn languages best. I grew up bilingual in French and English, thought that was just one of the best gifts my parents ever gave me, and thought, well, somebody should really create that. I spent about 3 months saying someone should make this language teaching program for young children, and eventually realized that someone was me. So started it with just a lot of passion, and I have the filmmaking background. We made a multimedia series that could be seen on any screen, any size, anywhere. Started with 6 languages, got up to 13 languages. So really kind of planted a flag and said, okay, we're the leader if you want to teach your young child a second language. And the first few years, we grew pretty quickly. We got to about 400,000 in revenues. And then the fact that I had not gone to business school, I didn't have a finance background, I had no entrepreneurial training, really caught up with me. And I really almost threw in the towel on the business. I got so exhausted. I know you're a dad. I had 2 little boys at home at the time. They were 3 and 6, and I was putting in these crazy long hours and working on weekends and started feeling like this isn't even really worth it. And that was when I got my first coaches and mentors and figured out how to take the business up to $1 million and then ultimately multi-million through raising venture capital, which, I know we're going to talk all about here today, but that was how I got started as an entrepreneur.
No, that's an amazing journey. Just kind of throwing yourself into it too. Just like, I want to solve this problem. No one else is solving it and making it happen despite the forces against you. But, being that this show is all about demystifying the fundraising experience, kind of walk us through what it was like raising capital back then. What were you doing? Kind of talk us about the time period and how much you raised. Kind of give us some of the details.
When I decided to raise venture capital, it was a little bit out of desperation, meaning I was like, okay, I either have to shut this thing down or figure out how to go big. And that took an incredible mindset upgrade. I really had a lot of limiting beliefs about what was possible for me. As a woman founder, I'd never met any woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar business, didn't know anyone who'd raised capital. I did eventually meet one woman who had raised venture capital, and she shared her term sheet with me, which was like amazing. And I'm still friends with her today. I still remind her and thank her. That was a game changer. But I had to do a lot of inner work and a lot of research. I sat down with tons of entrepreneurs who had raised capital, all men, and said, what'd you learn? How did it go? And I'm so thrilled there are resources like your podcast now to make it easier for people. But I spent 9-10 months researching because even though I didn't know much about raising capital, I had a hunch, and I was right, that you only get one shot at each potential investor. So I wanted to make sure I knew I wouldn't become fluent in venture capital, but I wanted to be at least conversational, drawing on, language teaching metaphors. So I just read a lot of books, talked to a lot of people, did a lot of pitching to board members and advisors, had them kick the tires. I remember a lot of, just practice runs at it, and eventually started going out and meeting people.
How did you go about meeting those people? How did you go about finding those people to meet and talk to?
Mainly through one person who really believed in me. That was the start of it. I want to give credit to my best friend from high school's father, who worked in banking. My parents were academics, so I really didn't have that example. My father did create the Pimsleur method, which is a best-selling language teaching method. It's owned by Simon & Schuster. So people think like, oh, you grew up at the foot of this entrepreneur. But in fact, he created the method, and it was really incredible and game-changing for the language teaching world, for adults, not for little kids. And then unfortunately, he passed away when I was only 8. Like, I really didn't get, to see him build that beyond there. It was then taken over by other companies. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that was a successful business. So interestingly, I grew up with my mom, single mom, teacher, trying to support, our family here in New York City. I've been working since I was 13, went all through high school and college on scholarship. And so when I went out to have those conversations, I really didn't have very many people to have them with. But I did have my best friend from high school's father, and I sat down with him over lunch. He'd always been very mentorly to me. And I remember I better bring a budget. So I brought this printed out Excel budget. And at lunch, he said, so where do you want to go with this company? And I was like, well, look, we've only been in business for a year. We've made $158,000. I didn't even quit my job yet. I'm just managing this amazing woman I found who works 3 days a week. And I send her messages on my BlackBerry before work and at lunch. But we've somehow made $158,000, and there's so much potential here. And he was sold. I mean, he had some connections to France. I really loved the French language. I think it was personal for him, plus our relationship. And I'll never forget, he said, well, how much do you need? And I was like, I think I need $1 million. And I pulled the Excel spreadsheet out of my bag and put it on the table, and we went through it together. And then he said these 5 words that really changed my life, where he said, I can help you get $1 million. And of course, in my mind, Jason, that was like he was going to write $1 million check. It was like, great, I got the check. What it really meant was he was willing to introduce me to people he knew who were in his social circles, who had already invested in other startups. This was really my first foray into this world. I had no idea how it worked. But, I went to all these meetings and probably met with, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 people that fall, was able to raise Series A. I had already raised some friends and family before that, but really very little, just enough to like make the pilot and produce those first few videos that we were selling. So that was the game-changing moment. And he taught me a lot about how to pitch, how to get not just get the meeting, but get the check.
Yeah, it's one thing. Yeah, it's one thing to maybe get a meeting, but when it comes down to actually getting that cash in your bank account, it's a different story sometimes.
Right. So, well, and there's also that gender difference. Sorry to interrupt, but I know you said, well, what's the difference raising while female, right? When we had our little prep call. And I would say for women, there's a much higher incidence of you can get the meeting, but you can't get the check. Of course, it's hard for any founder pitching, but I think because there are fewer of us out there, when, you reach out to a VC and they're sort of intrigued, it's like, okay, I'll hear what you got. You obviously must have something if you got this far. So they will take the meeting, but then we don't get the check that often. So that's one thing we're helping women with at $1 Million Whip.
So there's a couple of things I want to unpack there. I want to go back to the Series A, but I think just with the point you just mentioned right there, why do you think that is? Why do you think that women may get the meeting, but not the check?
Well, studies have shown that we all have this unconscious confirmation bias, right? Where we tend to believe that people who are like us will do a better job. It comes up in hiring, right? Plus, VCs are all about pattern recognition. So there haven't been as many successful women-run companies compared to, male-run companies. I mean, the stats right now are pretty dismal. In 2022, 1.9% of venture capital went to women-run companies. Now, that's exclusively women-run companies. It goes up a little more if it's a team that has women and men on it, or people who don't identify solely as women. So that's a big challenge. And then there are very few women VCs. So you're mainly pitching to people who don't share your experience. Like in my case, coming up with a language teaching program for young children, studies show that moms, at the time anyway, were doing 85% of the purchasing of educational materials for their kids. So we had a lot of VCs saying, oh, this sounds interesting, let me ask my wife, as opposed to having had any real experience with buying these educational products for their kids, which is a huge multi-billion-dollar market, but just not one that touched their everyday life.
I think it's a valid point. And I think you brought up a term called pattern recognition, which, I think a lot of entrepreneurs just don't really get why they don't get meetings or why things don't progress. And it has a lot to do with this thing called pattern recognition. They see thousands of deals, and they see them kind of come to fruition. They see a deal like, okay, I saw you do ABC here, and I saw it happen, somewhere else. It didn't work, so it's just an automatic like blocker. And unfortunately, if you don't look, act, and talk like me, I don't know if you will do what I'm capable of doing. Therefore, I don't feel comfortable investing.
And it's the founder and it's the company, right? Because so in my case, they might have believed that I was the right person at the right time to do this. I was the daughter of a Pimsleur, had filmmaking background. There were reasons to think I could pull this off. But at the same time, they had never heard of a kids company that had sold for, $1 billion or anything. So I referenced Rosetta Stone a lot, which is not as big a brand today. But at the time, they were in every airport, every magazine on the plane, right? So when I came up with the phrase, it's like Rosetta Stone for little kids, that was like ka-ching. People started to get it. And so I often recommend to female founders who are like, oh, well, this isn't like anything anybody knows. It's like, well, find something they know and say that it's at least in that family, because it's going to be very hard, especially if you're a first-time founder, for them to imagine you doing something they haven't seen very many people like you do, building a company they've really never seen reach great success.
That's a great advice. And so I want to go back. You mentioned the Series A. You had previously raised a little bit of capital from friends and family. I guess come talk to us, how much did you raise at the friends and family level? And then how far did that get you to the point where, you guys went out and raised your Series A? And how much did you raise for your Series A?
Yes. So we raised $460,000 from the friends and family. We had only raised enough to sort of produce the first few videos by the time I sat down with the friend of the family. And then we were able to raise $1.1 million in our Series A, and then another $1.2 million. And over time, we raised a total of $6 million. Over time, 2008 to 2014. So that was like a long journey. But, we kept raising the valuation, going into new markets. We entered the early education market in daycare centers, expanded to other countries. Ultimately, we were in over 10 countries. So that was a lot of where that capital went.
And I think it's interesting because, everyone listening to this podcast now thinks Series A is like, $5, $10, $20 million rounds. And, the reality back then, that was not the case. And there wasn't really seed or pre-seed back then. It's something that's kind of continuously to evolve in most recent years.
That's true. No one used the term seed back then. It was just convertible note straight to Series A.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. I remember when my first venture-backed company in 2013, we were trying to raise $1 million on a $3 million valuation for our Series A. It's just like, that's like laughable.
I think my first valuation was something like $6 million. No, not the very first. I think it was like $3 million. Ultimately, it was $6 million, as we got further into the rounds, but not the crazy inflated numbers you're seeing today at all.
Yeah, it's a completely different game now. There's a lot of attention in the space now. But so you basically, let's walk us through that. So basically at the end of 2014, you raised some additional capital, but you ended up selling the company. You ended up having a victory. Tell us about that journey. What ultimately led to the company having an acquisition?
Yeah. Well, I wrote the book behind me, this $1 Million Women, about my journey building the company. That was about 7 years in. And right around that same time, I realized that we were going to have to convert completely to digital, because just taking us back, this was DVDs. We sold many millions of worth of product at Toys R Us, Babies R Us, right? It was another time. And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, let's bring in a new CEO who's digital native, will really take us to that next place. And so after I wrote this book, wound up pivoting and becoming a coach for women business owners, now building a tech platform for women business owners, which we can get into later. But I really want to shout out my board, because they stayed loyal to the company right through many years later, working with new CEOs. I took a step back. I was on the board, but not involved in the day-to-day. We handed off to the new CEO. And this is not something people talk about enough, because it's not always this really clear road, right? Of like, you build it and 7 years in, you sell it, and then you do whatever you want the rest of your life. It's not always like that. So in my case, it was like, I was ready to step away. I knew I wasn't the right person to keep running it. We brought in a new CEO. I started this new business. But then after a few years, we thought, okay, it's time to sell. Like we want to sell. So we put it out. We had several offers. And the one we liked best, for multiple reasons, was from a longstanding partner Mango Languages, which bought the company and is taking it to new heights, especially in the library market where they're very strong. And they had been one of our biggest partners for a decade. So that was a really great, longstanding relationship. We were happy to see our IP land in their home.
When did you realize that you were not the CEO to take it to the next level?
Well, it's very personal running businesses, right? I mean, especially if you created it partly inspired by your children. So for 7 years, my kids were the target customer age, right? Because our program was for little kids 0 to 6 to learn French, Spanish, Chinese, Italian. That's the age kids learn best. My kids were that age. I was our target demographic, that mom. But as my kids moved into like middle school, right? And I wasn't with those same moms. I didn't really know what those moms needed or wanted. Of course, my head of marketing was on top of that, but I just didn't feel as connected to it. And I wanted the company to succeed more than I wanted to be the one running it, and saw that sometimes founders hang on too long. It's not always the best thing for the company. And I didn't want to be one of those founders. I thought if I don't have that, make it happen passion every single morning for this anymore, 7, 8 years in, then let's find someone who does and let them take a crack at it.
I think that's a profound execution of fiduciary responsibility as a CEO, to recognize that you staying in that position can actually be more negative impact to the company as opposed to bringing someone in over time to grow and eventually lead to an exit. And I think that's something that you did a very good job of explaining, that kind of thought process. And I feel a lot of founders should look at themselves and just, assuming that, I think it takes the business getting to some kind of sustainability
It's not easy to step away, right? Because you have your identity very wrapped up in it. But I also think it's good to realize, like, you're not the company's not you, especially once you take venture money, right? I had a lot of board members and was so grateful that they helped shepherd the company through, everything that came after that, right through to the sale, same board. So that's something I always like to share, because I know a lot of people are afraid to raise capital because they're like, well, then I'll have all these people in my business, and I want to make all the decisions. And that is true, but you also have other people who care about your baby. And that is really amazing, especially if, you decide to do something else and want help shepherding it into a new era, or when you're making the sale. So there are a lot of upsides to having those board members and ambassadors, as long as you have the right one.
Yeah. And I think that's the key point, is like, when you take money from other people, expect a 5 to 10 year relationship, and make sure that you want to see that person's face for the next 5 to 10 years. And that they also want to see yours and engage with you, and make sure that you're coachable. That's one of the kind of the key factors that VCs look for, is that you're a coachable individual to build that relationship over a long time. So, all right, so you end up selling the company, but in the midst of all that, you were not necessarily maybe day to day in the company when it goes and sells, but still a victory, not to the belt, exciting, and I'm sure that kind of helps contribute to your network at $1 Million Women. Give us kind of the update on where you're at with $1 Million Women.
Yeah, so for about 5 years after I left Little Pim, I was just coaching about 100 women a year through an executive education program we built online. I stayed in the ed tech lane and wanted to build some scalable way of helping more women get to 1 million. We talked about the stats for venture capital, but there's some parallel stats for women in business where just 2 to 3% of women business owners ever get to 1 million in revenues. And that's just getting off go in the business world, right? That's just table stakes, getting to 1 million. So when we got to 1 million at Little Pim, I got calls from journalists. It was this whole big thing. And I was like, why are you even calling me? It's just 1 million. And they were like, at the time, they were like, only 1.9% of women ever get there. So as someone who had been a women's studies minor in college and just really interested in closing the economic gender gap, I thought, this is my next thing. The book tackled the topic, but I knew women really just needed access to coaching and mentorship and business skills like I was able to get when I needed that help. So for 5 years, we've been doing that, and also having summits. We have about 25,000 women on our mailing list we've been helping over the years. And the pandemic was a big turning point, Jason, because things really fell apart for women small business owners, and that's who we were working with. So we realized that our business model of a affordable but still an investment business program they could take, $5,000 to $6,000, way better than $100,000 for business school, but still an investment. We thought, let's create something where any woman business owner anywhere in the country can get access. So we launched a tech platform that is for learning and networking for women business owners who are making between 50,000 and 750,000, wanting to get to 1 million. And it turns out that is what I like to call the invisible majority of women business owners, because folks in the VC and angel ecosystem sometimes forget that the women they see fundraising are really just about 2% of all women entrepreneurs. 98% of women entrepreneurs are either not raising capital or raising alternative capital. And they don't have a YPO or an EO or a Vistage or any of these organizations. So this is the first time that that's been accessible to them, and we are super excited about building it.
I'd like to unpack that last point a little bit more in terms of these mentor groups or peer groups that I'm familiar with, EO, the Entrepreneur Organization, YPO, and there's so many out there, but they are not exclusive to men, but they are predominantly, men in those groups. Kind of walk us through what those groups do, what your groups do that really kind of change the game for founders. If, the founders listening aren't familiar with these peer groups, kind of what's the real value add of these types of groups?
Yeah, I think anyone who's running a business knows that it's incredibly lonely. You're making really tough decisions all day long. The secret to your business growth really is in your network, whether you're out raising capital or just doing deals or looking to hire the best people for your team. And so that's why people join entrepreneurs organizations and YPOs, but they all have a revenue minimum to join. So EO, it's $1 million. YPO, I think it's something like 10 million. And if you look at what women business owners are making, there's just a tiny handful of them who even qualify for those organizations. I was in Entrepreneurs Organization for 6 years. I served on the board for 4 of those years, made some incredible friends, got so much value out of it, but ultimately felt like I want to go build something like this, but fully online so that women could access it from anywhere for all the people who are not in the room. And that is about 14 million women entrepreneurs. And that number is going up so fast, Jason. So many women are starting businesses, especially post-pandemic. Like, they don't want to go back to the office, as we all know, and not being able to have that flexibility, especially those who have a family. So we're seeing a big increase in women starting businesses. And, this is the future. A lot of women in the gig economy. I'm sure you're even seeing it in your own circles.
I am curious, it's a big jump from running a $50,000, $150,000 revenue business that's more of a lifestyle, complementary business to your life, to making it a real business in some cases, as one might say, to get to that $1 million+ mark. Is that the right path for everyone, or is it how do women kind of make that decision on if it's the right, or any business owner to make that decision?
Well, because we're $1 million women, we tend to attract women who have big ambitions, right? So we get the women who have a business that's working, but maybe they just don't know how to double their revenues, or maybe they don't know the scalable part of it. I remember one of our grads, Shelly, she's from Florida, first-time entrepreneur, Black woman in, I think it's Tampa or that area. And she has a pole fitness studio where women come and their workout is like with a pole, right? The dancing, super fun. But she came to us and she was like, I don't want to be standing in this studio all day. I love what I do, but there's got to be another way of delivering this incredible experience. So going through our 12-week online program, we helped her figure out how to make an app instead of, or as a complement to coming into the studio. She created that app right before the lockdown for the pandemic. And I hadn't been in touch with her in a couple of months because she was done with the program. And about 6 months into the pandemic, I got this DM on Facebook and she was like, Julia, you're not going to believe this. I just made $108,000 in 3 months. And it was the app. It turns out that women wanted her to send them the pole, so they would install a pole themselves in their house and then do the workouts on the app. And she's now, Jason, at $2 million in revenues and considering raising capital.
Wow. That is an amazing
story, right? So sometimes it's just that no one has sat down with them and said, how else can you run this company? I had the benefit of that in EO with mentors and coaches, and Vern Harnish, who created a lot of the curriculum that EO uses in its accelerator program that I went through. They ask these questions, and most women I talk to in our programs, we also have 3 other coaches. So it's not just me with a big team and a board and advisors. Most of the women have never had someone to walk them through those questions and help them figure out, how do you make this business more scalable?
I guess, now having your history building Little Pim, raising capital, looking at the markets today, granted, still a very small amount of the giant pool of venture capital goes to women, but what's kind of your thoughts on how fundraising is today in comparison to what it was, years ago when you were raising capital for Little Pim?
Right. Well, anyone raising capital right now is definitely fighting an uphill battle. This is a tough time with the markets where they are. So I think this is one of those moments where we're seeing a lot of consolidation. We're seeing people pressing pause on their fundraising. We just raised $400,000 for a pre-seed, and it was way harder than anything I had to do 10 years ago, where I think people were really hungry for these opportunities, where I think right now is a big wait and see moment, right? Because I'm always helping women raise capital for their companies, and they don't always get that for the investors. It usually makes sense to just wait and see, right? If they reach those milestones. And so unless you've got some kind of a real external pressure, reason to raise the money, I remember Jeff Beck, who was on your podcast, talked about how he had a goal of raising everything by November, in part because there was something very seasonal about his business where that made sense, and all the investors got that. I had that same thing with Little Pim. I remember closing one of my $1.1 million rounds and saying, we have to get this money in by the summer so we can make these big marketing bets and have it pay off in Q4, where we make 40% of our revenue as a children's product company, ed tech product company. So investors got that and were willing to, get off the sidelines. But it's not always easy to make that happen, especially in these kind of adverse market conditions.
Market's tough right now, especially, one thing I warn founders when they come to us and they're just like, we're launching in 3 weeks and we're raising $1 million or whatever it is. And then I was like, well, do you have enough runway to get 3 weeks? They're like, yeah. I'm like, all right, well, let's see what happens. It's something that's...
3 weeks just to get the phone call.
Yeah, it's
yeah. I mean, when you meet the right person, it can go very quickly, right? But often it's a very long, slow process. And I'm certainly a big believer in the method you've talked about on your podcast of having a monthly update, keeping people informed. I figured out early on when I was fundraising, I probably pitched to, over 400 people at this point, given the last raise and this raise. That for me, what keeps me sane when I'm fundraising is thinking about it as friend raising, not fundraising, because a very small subset of the people you talk to are going to be your investors. But lots of people you talk to could be folks you stay friends with, folks you refer people to, people who will come and speak at one of your events, someone who's going to promote your next book or you're going to promote their next book. So that is part of how I get through all these conversations. Is a good outcome is hey, I made a new relationship and who knows where that'll go.
That's why I tell founders, when you come to those meetings, don't necessarily come with your pitch hat on and force shovel your pitch down their throat. It's more of get to know that person on the other side, have a human to human conversation and build that rapport. Then they'll ask you questions about your bit. They should have looked at your deck already. They should never have an idea. They took the meeting. There's already some level of interest there. Spend that time wisely, as you say, friend raising, which we might, make that a clip from the podcast. Say, I like the friend raising.
Well, if you're leaning in, you have something, right? If they're kind of asking you more things and they really want to dig in. But if it's oh yeah, that sounds cool. That's great. Oh, my sister did something like that. You're probably not gonna be getting that check or wire transfer.
Incredible signaling in a conversation is if they lean in, continue to probe about the business, it's a good sign. If they say, wow, sounds like you got something really great, then they just kind of leave it at that, or they just kind of wow, sounds like you figured it all out, or sounds like you're going to do great.
Yeah, but what? It's all kind of a big game in the end of not it, right? Okay, this is not it. So let's keep moving because maybe the next one is it. And if you're not up for that, then definitely shouldn't fundraise. Because I only know one person in all the people I've ever met who raised $5 million on the first conversation. It's a woman I interviewed for my series on LinkedIn called Go Big Now Live. And she ran a yoga studio. There was a woman who took the classes of the yoga studio. She pitched to that woman's husband. He was in private equity and he wrote a $5 million check. I've never heard a story like that before or after that story.
Wow. No, unfortunately, doing this podcast, I've definitely heard of those stories where it's
You
just
have?
like,
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad they're out
they
there.
do exist. Those are,
Not so much around among women. We tend to be like out there really hustling, talking to, hundreds of people.
yeah, I would classify it more as boys club type fundraising, where it's like they're already a part of the club. They already have the relationship. They're of high net worth individuals. And, it's an easier conversation when they've known each other for years, whether they went to college, those types of things. So I do see those types of things happen. Maybe not 5 million. I think that's a bit of a stretch.
Right? Yeah, that's a pretty big first check. That's not bad.
That's a big thing. I would say that's probably unusual. I don't really see, 5 million get deployed on the first check.
Well, you brought up something that's another one of those differences between men and women raising, which is that most guys I know who've been to a college where they kept a bunch of buddies, maybe they were in a fraternity, maybe they went to Ivy League, maybe they didn't, they have gotten a phone call at some point or another from someone who's like, hey, Bill, I just started this really cool company. And remember, George, he's in for 25K. Are you in for 25K too? And when I say to women, have you ever gotten that phone call? I mean, women who I went to Yale with, women who graduated from Stanford, Harvard, George Washington, they're like, no, I've never gotten that phone call. Now, I'm sure some women have, but way fewer than men. It's a lot more accepted among guys to call each other and do that. Whereas for women, we're still trying to undo a lot of socialization around raising money, talking about money. Is that somehow unfeminine to be out asking for money? There's all kinds of stuff we've got to break through. And so I think it's really up to my generation and the generations coming right after me to set a whole new precedent for what it means to be a woman raising money, maybe raising a family at the same time, and have it be acceptable to go to your network and raise that first friends and family, which can then be the on-ramp to that Series A ultimately. But a lot of women just never get there.
So let's conclude and dive a little bit more on that. Just like, what would be your advice to women out there that think they got something big? Maybe they already have something that, is progressing and making progress. What's your advice to them?
My advice to women who want to raise capital is always to figure out where that capital is going to take you, and is there a big enough opportunity to go pursue angel or venture? Because I get a lot of women coming to me saying, I think we're going to make 15 million in 5 years. And they're really super excited about that. But then I have to sort of rain on their parade and say, well, that's really not going to catch the attention of an angel or a VC. So if there really is at least like $100 million opportunity here that could ultimately be valued at $1 billion or so, now you're onto something. But I think women really need to learn the game before they go out and play the game. That's what I did. I spent 9-10 months studying. I'm not suggesting anybody does that. Now it can go much quicker with podcasts like yours. But to talk to people who've raised, maybe hire a coach, get some mentors to help you, and figure out how this game is played. Because it's been played like this for a couple hundred years. And we're trying to shift it slowly so that women are a bigger part of the angel and VC world. But it's still very much a boys club the way it stands. So got to learn how it works, got to make sure you got your numbers together, can pitch really well, and can make a case for why your company is going to be the next most amazing thing.
I love that. And thank you for sharing that feedback. Now, where can everyone that's listening learn more about you and your book and $1 Million Women?
Yeah, so we're really excited about working with women who are making 50,000 all the way up to $1 million. We do have some programs for women making 1 to 3 million. It's all at millionwomen.com. And I also can be found on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the places. So if you follow me, we'd love to keep you informed of our upcoming events and online opportunities and offline opportunities.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely make sure to link those in the show notes down below. But Julia, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing your story, hearing your journey, and being able to share that with our audience. So thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much for inviting me and creating a space for this important conversation about women and venture capital. We're going to see a lot of changes, and your podcast is going to help to make them. So thank you.
I plan to see it happen. I think there's enough things in motion nowadays with the resources and content available that hopefully we'll start to see more and more women that want it get it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jason.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. We hope you learned something valuable. And if you did, be sure to let us know in the comments or by hitting that like button. If you're a founder looking to raise capital, be sure to check out our platform, thunder.vc, to use our AI to identify which investors are most qualified to invest in your business. It's free to join. Just go to thunder.vc. Again, that is thunder.vc. And if you're new, we release new episodes every week. And if you or someone you know recently raised a round and want to share your story, be sure to email me at jason@thunder.vc. That's our show, and we hope to see you next week.